Hi, welcome to this video. It is the third and hopefully final part of my short video series where I'm talking about macros applications, and today we'll be talking about chained applications. Chained applications are not a separate structure within Alteryx, but rather chained applications are a methodology by which you will link one application to another application in a chain as long as you need it to be, but typically it's just two or three of the applications chained together. The questions that you always ask is, two, why would I need to chain applications together? Well, if you listened or watched my previous video where we talked about applications, towards the end there I showed you how applications have some abnormal behavior when it comes to providing data into one of your interface widgets. And so to overcome this data issue, and it's really when you have data that changes and you need to see most current data, that's the why. The how is then you actually need to chain applications, and we'll talk about the mechanics of chaining one application to another to overcome this little problem that you have with dynamic data. That being said, let's go ahead and bring in my Alteryx. I have this simple little workflow that I created to highlight one of the little problems, just to talk about it briefly before we begin to chain them. And as you can see, I have a little workflow down here where I take in a comma separated list of values, separate them out through the column to text to columns, but actually we split it by rows, the cute little thing hidden over here. And what I get then is one row for each of my choices. And what I want to do is be able to ask the person what their colors are that they want to choose to run into my application. And so I actually have a file out there called color names. I made it a CSV file just so it's very easy to open it. And you can see it has these colors in it. So what happens is that I want to bring this into an application workflow. And in this type of data, since they can choose more than one color, we want to go ahead and bring it into my list box. And we'll say choose your color set. Let's call it color palette. And when we get done with this, what we want to do is just make it comma separated. So I want to go ahead and change these down here to be just a comma. And the list of values that I want to choose are not field types, but fields from the connected tool, which I have not connected. And if you remember, I can't really connect this directly in because I need it to be the columns that get pulled in from an external piece of data. And so there are two problems. Let's go ahead and pick our transform, which is where we want to go ahead and make it a crosstab, where I bring the columns, the rows into columns, and you'll notice I need two columns in here. I don't have two columns. This presents me with a bit of a problem to begin with, so I have to do additional work. To overcome this, I actually have another data set that I used rather than manipulate the data, which I would have to do otherwise. So we're going to go ahead and change this from color names to color name 2. Hit the refresh button. You see that I have indeed added two columns just to make this widget a little bit easier. Also prep me for some other things that we'll be talking about. So we have name and description. We need to go ahead and choose just a single value because this is an aggregate function. So now I actually, if I run this directly, you see that now I have columns that are my colors. I can drag this into here, go back to my interface, drag an action into it as well. Ran out of a little bit of room. Let's go ahead and drag this guy over to the side just to keep this as clean as you can to see what's going on. Drag the update value action into here. And remember that because this is a list box, we don't have the update just cell. We want to go ahead and update a value, so we have to find that value. It's over here in the drop down, data R. There's my value. Everything looks cool. I can run this, and this pops me up with multiple colors. And as I always forget to do, we'll cancel that because we have to go over into my interface designer, and don't forget that we need to go into the configuration and make sure we see that browse when we come out. Having done that, we can now run this. Here's my window. Let's go ahead and choose red, white, and blue. Red, white, and blue for my 3 colors. Click finish, and you can see my choices are blue, red, and white, which is the order that they were in the drop down. Everything is great. We want to begin to run this and go on with life, but while we're developing, we realize that, oh, we really actually needed a few more colors. So if we come over into our data file, here's a quick little data editor, and you can see the name and description that we use. Let's go ahead and add orange into this list. So we do orange, and let's call it sunset. Just for a brief description, things excellent, save this out. We'll drop it back over here. So now when we run this as a application, you'll see that orange has not appeared. This is because, for some reason, I'm not exactly sure, but it's a known feature, if you want to call it a feature or a problem or a technicality of the Alteryx applications, is that it has a cache that's stored up here to run this with. So there's a couple ways I've tried to overcome this just to see how it would work and understand what's going on. So for example, if I bring up my temporary directory that I use, which is down here in WIP WIP, you can see we have all these temporary files floating around. So we go ahead and delete these temporary files. You can see that some of them are open and running, so this really doesn't help me to do this while this is running. So what I can do is go ahead and save this, which I've already done, but we'll save it again. Put this in my apps. This happens to be called app 1 when I originally worked with it. We'll go ahead and update it. So this nicely saved. We can close this off so that our temporary folder now becomes much more empty. Delete this off, get everything out of there. And we'll go ahead and in another directory, bring up my applications. You can see here we have chaining apps 1. So we go ahead and double click on this. It'll run it without opening up Alteryx, which is really neat. But lo and behold, you see the list still does not include orange. So we've got a bit of an issue here, which is the fact that it is still not refreshing that cache where it happens to be stored. So it becomes a bit perplexing, as you may notice. We'll cancel that out. We'll go ahead and start up Alteryx again. Let's drag these off to the side so I can find them easier the next time. So this is not your normal cache. It is some kind of super secret cache. So if we'll start up Alteryx, just to show you some of the issues associated with this little perplexing problem, we'll go ahead and open recent. We have this chaining app saved. If you look at this options, one of the choices it has down here is, rather than from a connected tool, let's go ahead and delete this from the connected tool. Just delete this tool completely. We'll leave it sit here just for purposes of looking at the data. So rather than from connected tool, we can choose external source. And it must, you notice this note here says must contain a name and a value. So we click on that, We're going to click on properties. We can go down here and choose our file, color name 2. And then if we run this app, we get an error because it really and truly needs 2 columns, one named name and one named value. So just having a nice set of data really doesn't help us. It has to be the right kind of data. So not to show you any magic, we'll go ahead and call this value. Save this out. Now if we run this as an application, you see that it does indeed come up with the orange as well, because now it is directly reading that file every time. So if we make changes to it, it will go ahead and run it out. And we'll look at that just in a minute, because as we hit finish, you'll notice that what it gave me as my choices is not the name, but the value. So that's sort of a nice feature if you want to do it. You can give them something in English in the name, and then the value being what you want to pass forward. I found that to be a little useful in some cases, but not typically what you immediately expected. We'll exit out of this, and we will go ahead and change the name to the data in our file. Drag this across. Let's give it value, since that's what we want to see, and name is what we want the users to see. Saving that out. There's a save button. We can go ahead and run our application again, and you'll notice that this immediately picks up the new piece of data that we created. There is nothing buffering when you're actually reading it by the interface widget itself, and you can see now it gives us some nice things. Well, we like tree leaves and we like sunset, and we'll hit the finish, and you can see that green and orange became my choices. So this just gives you an idea as to how the mechanics of this are going on and what you need to overcome if you really want to make this more dynamic other than managing your data. And what we're going to do when we talk about creating chained applications is we're going to use MySQL and connect to the database, because that is the thing that you're most likely to do. And connecting to your database involves an input widget. Let's exit out of here. And you cannot directly read something from the database in here. You must read from a file that has name and value in it. So we're going to go ahead and create some new workflows that use our MySQL database and show you how to chain those applications together to get you a dynamic list going into your interface widget. So let's look at how to overcome this problem with the data coming in dynamically, not being refreshed. And we're going to do that by bringing in some data from the database, because this is when I first experienced it and it was a bit frustrating. It had me actually give up on apps for a little while because I didn't understand what was going on. And I went ahead and created a table in MySQL database called MyColor. Querying it, it shows that we have 5 colors in there: blue, green, red, yellow, white. We also added this color description just to get ready for how all of this is going to work. Querying that into it and running this workflow. I've gone ahead and turned the rows into columns so that the data looks like we want it to look like to go into this application, which gives us the columns of the colors and the descriptions as the values. Turning this to an application very quickly. Hopefully you're getting used to doing this. We're going to go ahead and drop in the list box. And then drop the action onto it. Let's go ahead and move this around just to give us some place to work on this and keep it a bit clear, because there's not much going on. There's the checkbox, not the action box. There's our action box. Check onto it. Generate a custom list with just commas separating them. Use that to update our cell. And if you remember correctly, that action needed to be a little bit more detailed by going into data and our first value. Everything looks good, and as you're aware, we go ahead and we connect this input into there, double check the configuration. Looks good. We run this as an application. And our list box comes up completely empty. We click on Finish in this case. You'll see that it takes a while. Looking at the log, you can see that it went ahead and queried the database after it prompted us, which is never a good thing to do because that's where our data is coming from. Let's go and change this list box to say select your color palette. So we're going to go ahead and keep this as a workflow. Delete off these two widgets, because basically what we're going to want to do is just make this a standalone application, and we're going to pass the data directly into this list box. To make this work, we'll need to save this. We'll call this chain 2. So it stands by itself if it's able to read data into it. So we're going to create another workflow at the very top of this, and we're going to start that workflow off as simply querying the database, because we don't really need to do this movement, because if you go back and look at the palette, if we say external source, it must have a name and value fields. So it doesn't need the columns. So coming into this workflow, we can go ahead and put a browse on the end of this, or actually a select on the end of this, because this color description is the actual value. This is the name, what we want to display. So the user sees the English, and the behind the scenes code comes out. And that will be value. So all that we need to do with this is to go ahead and save it in a file. Easiest way to save this is put it in a temporary directory or a working directory, whichever you wish to call it, where you can save these type of files. So we'll go ahead and choose File. You see I've already been working on this one once, so this is the name that we decided to give it, which is color chain list. We will save that. So this workflow will go ahead and put out that file. If we run this, just to show you that we can run it as a normal workflow, it created that output file after querying the database. So we can come back into, or this is actually the process that you'll want to go through, which is to run that as a normal workflow and get the file out of it, so that here you can go ahead and choose the file, and it was what we just created. So now when we run this as an application, go ahead and update that. So we'll run this as a workflow or an application. And you see that it goes ahead and brings us up our list. We choose a couple things off of it. Click the finish. Forgot to configure this. Show us that browse so we can see the data guy. Now let's save this again. So we make sure it was saved as the updated version. Execute it. Choose two of our colors. Finish it. And it shows us the two colors that we chose. And you notice that it displays the English version and puts the actual code that we want to use to process it within here. So now we know that this works. Let's go back to our first one. And what we would like to do is to have this chain from one to the other. We look at configurations of the workflow. You see that there's nothing we can do to chain them together. So we'll go ahead and turn this into an analytic app. And now we go into the interface designer. And what we want to do is in configuration, we don't want to do anything on success, except for we want to run this next application. So we called this chain 2. So now what we've done is we've forced this into being an application and had it so that when it finishes running, it will connect us to the first application. So if we run this as an application, it has nothing to show us, so it just gives us a blank screen. We type in continue. Little database configuration touch errors, really not there. There we go. It queries it, creates the file for us, gives us the choices. We can finish that and see our color choices. Look at our output log. Pretty simple and straightforward at this point. We can either go and make some other choices and keep running through this. This is sort of a then recursive loop if I want to do something that does involve multiple steps if I need to. And then I can exit out of it and everything's done. Now I personally just don't like that blank screen to come up. So what I typically do when I create this front end process, I go ahead and put a checkbox there. Where's my checkbox? Let's take a checkbox here. Have it say press continue to choose a color palette. And I check the default value just to make it look sort of pretty. So now when I run this, it brings me up the question of checkbox. If you get going too fast through this, don't click on Whitespace. It doesn't actually update what you just typed in. Sort of frustrating sometimes, but I run into it regularly enough that I get used to it. So having done that, now the question comes up, says press continue to choose a color palette. Hit continue. Fill this in. Let's choose like the sea. Hit finish. There's my choices. And exit takes me back out of this. So that's the way you can get your applications to deal with dynamic data by chaining them together. If you have a multi-step process, you can chain as many of these as you like. I saw somewhere that once you get above 30, it begins to act strange, but typically one of the database actions I did was to go ahead and query a schema, choose your schema, query the list of tables, and then from that list of tables, go ahead and choose what you want to do as far as maybe querying or dropping them. And that was a 3-part chain, one to query the schema, one to query your tables, and one to do the work. But again, it lets you know how to get over that dynamic issue. Makes it look sort of cumbersome when you use it perhaps, but it gets the job done. Makes it so it's a very easily and very repeatable process that'll help people get some work done. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe if you like this channel. Send me some comments. Let me know you like it by clicking the like. If you have any additional questions or some other things you need to see, go ahead and put them in the comments, and I'll look to accommodate you in the future. Thanks.